They didn't just kill for profit. They killed for purpose and called it grace. That's a line that was buried in an 1874 court ledger, blacked out with ink, later scrubbed from all official records. But not before one man copied it by hand. You were never supposed to read it. This story was never supposed to exist. And once you hear it, you won't see history the same way again. Because behind every founding myth of America is a nightmare. And in the shadow of the Oregon Trail, where desperate families once clawed toward hope, stood a chapel that promised salvation and delivered death. Welcome to the legacy of the Grayson family. Missionaries in name, executioners in practice. For 36 years, they turned scripture into a weapon and mercy into a mask. What they did along that 20-mile stretch in eastern Oregon wasn't just evil. It was engineered. A system of quiet extermination. Perfectly timed, perfectly hidden, and worse, blessed by those who claim to serve God. You're not watching this by accident. You felt it, haven't you? That something has always been wrong beneath the surface, behind the smiling faces, beneath the gilded crosses, inside the systems built to save us. This is not just a story of murder. This is a blueprint for how institutions bury truth, and how darkness survives not in shadows, but in the open when cloaked in good intentions. And make no mistake, the Graysons were not isolated monsters. They were the prototype, the seed of something that would echo in orphanages, in asylums, in boarding schools and churches across America and beyond. Control systems disguised as care, pain administered in the name of healing. This isn't just a descent into their crimes. It's a confrontation with the system that let them thrive, and the deeper truths it reflects about our world. You will not leave this journey the same. So, if you're ready, really ready to pull back the veil, then take a breath. Because once you descend, there's no going back. You just open the door to the macabre past of the Grayson family, a sinister legacy. And the truth doesn't ask permission to change you. It just does. It began like most horrors do, with kindness. In the spring of 1852, nestled in the rolling hills east of Blue Mountains, a wooden chapel appeared like a divine gift to dying men. Its white steeple pierced the sky like a dagger through cloud, offering promise to those worn thin by the Oregon Trail. To the weary, it was sanctuary. To the doomed, it was final confession. And to the Graysons, it was a trap. Father Morai Grayson stood at the center of it all. Tall, skeletal, dressed in black. His sermons bled with scripture, but his eyes betrayed no light. He claimed to be a missionary sent by the Lord. But in truth, he was an architect of ritualized death. Beside him stood Sister Constance, gentle, soft-spoken, learned in herbs. She bathed the sick, kissed the dying, and mixed her poisons with saintly calm. To watch her was to believe in angels. To drink from her hands was to enter the grave. Brother Ezekiel was a third, quiet, strong, helpful, a man who could fix a wagon, calm a child, or bury a body without changing expression. He was the executor, the collector, the one who sorted through what was left. They weren't fanatics. They were scientists of suffering. And they understood one eternal truth. When people are desperate enough, they'll trust anyone who offers hope in the name of God. That first year alone, more than 30 families passed through the Sacred Heart Chapel. Only 24 were ever accounted for at their destinations. And none of the missing were ever tied to the chapel, not officially, because the Graysons knew how to mask the crime behind the cross. And the wilderness has no memory. But one man suspected. He was a trapper, nameless in records, just WJ, and he passed the chapel on his way east. He said he saw something no one believed. A line of wagons, abandoned, neatly stacked, behind the chapel's back grove, and beside them, 6 unmarked mounds. He reported it. Nothing was done, because the Graysons were godly people, and godly people, in that time and place, were above suspicion. But what if righteousness was a perfect camouflage? What if salvation was the deadliest lie ever told? This wasn't murder. It was sacrifice, and the trail was just the altar. The Morrison family was the first to vanish without a trace. James, Elizabeth, their 3 children, and Elizabeth's elderly father, gone within 17 days. On paper, they died of trail sickness. In truth, they were test subjects. The Graysons didn't just kill. They studied. Sister Constance documented symptoms like a physician. She noted how much arsenic each person could tolerate before organ failure. She tracked fever spikes, skin tone changes, final words. To her, suffering was data. Pain was progress. Brother Ezekiel cataloged the dead's possessions, weights, quantities, estimated trade value. He noted burial depth, soil softness, decomposition rates. To him, each grave was a ledger, each family an investment. And Father Morai, he perfected the script, the prayers he spoke over the dying, the stories he told neighbors, the sermons he delivered after each burial, speaking of divine will and earthly sorrow. It was a closed system, problem, solution, disposal, and all under the banner of Christian mercy. They even built a ritual around it. Step 1, identify the vulnerable, a broken wagon, a sick child, a mother too tired to speak. Step 2, offer sanctuary, soft words, warm food, prayer. Step 3, administer the remedy, herbal infusions laced with arsenic called purifications of the spirit. Step 4, blame the trail. Say the family was already sick. Say you tried everything. Step 5, bury the dead. Perform the rites, sing the hymns, and take what's left. But the most disturbing detail? They believed they were doing God's will. Father Morai wrote in his private journal, later recovered and heavily redacted, that the Lord separates the wheat from the chaff. We are but his hands. He saw his victims not as people, but as offerings, offerings that purified the land, offerings that filled his coffers and his soul. This wasn't insanity. It was theology, the idea that some are chosen and the rest are fuel. Sound familiar? Because this blueprint didn't die in 1888. It mutated into medical institutions, into boarding schools, into war sold as salvation. The Graysons were just the beginning. And once you see it, you start to realize maybe the darkest institutions don't hide in shadows. They build steeples. The Oregon Trail was never just a road west. It was a crucible where families were stripped down to their essentials, faith, flesh, and fear. And the Graysons understood something no government, no sheriff, no passing missionary ever fully grasped. Desperation makes men forget to ask questions. By the spring of 1853, they had evolved from opportunistic murderers to methodical executioners. And they had one goal: refinement. Every element of their system was upgraded. The chapel basement was divided into 3 sectors, one for storage, one for body prep, and one for what Father Morai called divine separation. That's where the sick were taken, to die alone, in prayer, far from the ears of their families. Sister Constance had begun mixing new compounds, combining arsenic with powdered aconite and belladonna. The deaths became faster, but still looked natural. Nausea, fever, respiratory collapse. She even began injecting small doses into wounds, calling it a blessing against gangrene. No one questioned her. She prayed as she worked. Ezekiel built a false wall in the chapel attic to hide high-value items, coin purses, jewelry, heirlooms. He sold them in trading towns 40 miles east, always under aliases, always alone, always to merchants who asked no questions. Morai, meanwhile, shifted from scripture to suggestion. He began using guilt as a tool, telling fathers their children died because they had lost faith, convincing mothers that their suffering was part of God's plan. His sermons became weapons of emotional surrender. And it worked, because people don't run from killers and collars. They kneel before them. By 1855, something new entered their method: selection. Not everyone who passed through Sacred Heart was murdered, only those unworthy. Families with gold, with land deeds, with silk linens, they were chosen. Those with nothing, they were spared, sent along with blessings and a few biscuits. This selective mercy gave the Graysons a reputation, not a menace, but a discernment. Word spread along the trail. Stop at the chapel if you can. They're good people. They only help the ones God brings them. Exactly. And this is where the manipulation became generational. Because families who survived the chapel became its greatest evangelists. They told others, They spread the myth. They built the shield that hid the blade. And every innocent recommendation was another neck laid bare. In May of 1855, the Graysons crossed a line even they had once considered unthinkable. They took a child who wasn't dying. Her name was Lydia Holt, age 9, auburn hair, bright eyes. She was traveled with her uncle and aunt, the last living relatives she had after cholera wiped out her parents in Nebraska. The Holts weren't wealthy. They had no gold, no livestock to spare. But Lydia, she sang hymns in the chapel with such purity that Father Morai said, "She reminds me of the seraphim." And that was the moment she was marked for something different, not for death, but for transformation. That spring, a new chamber was dug beneath the altar, smaller than the others, not for storage, but living space. It contained a straw mattress, a chamber pot, a tin bowl, and a small wooden cross etched crudely into the wall. Lydia was a first-kept soul. They told her aunt and uncle she had taken ill suddenly in the night and passed away. They even let them see a covered child's body in the chapel morgue. It was another girl, already buried and exhumed. The grieving Holts moved on down the trail, unaware their niece still breathed 3 feet beneath where they prayed. Lydia was fed scraps, taught scripture, made to recite in the dark, over and over until her voice broke. They called it the reclamation. Father Morai believed some souls were too pure to be exposed to the world. He believed they had to be refined through isolation, silence, and obedience until they became vessels for divine instruction. Sister Constance called it training. Ezekiel called it cleansing. What Lydia called it, we'll never know, because she never spoke again. Years later, a trader named Angus Phelps would swear he saw a pale girl with sunken eyes staring out from a slot behind the chapel's main cross. He said it wasn't a ghost. He said she blinked. His report was dismissed as drunken fantasy. But local children began telling stories about a chapel girl who whispered verses at night. This was the Graysons' evolution. Not just killers, not just thieves, but keepers of chosen vessels. They believed they were crafting messengers. Children shaped by silence and scripture. Because to the Graysons, power wasn't just taken. It was bred. The Graysons were no longer just exploiting the Oregon Trail. They were reshaping it. Like a parasite that enters the bloodstream and rewrites your DNA. They rewrote the spiritual topography of the western frontier. And they did it through whispers. By 1856, Sacred Heart Chapel had developed a terrifying dual existence. By day, it remained a sanctuary, offering rest, prayer, and recovery to westward families. A place where saintly Sister Constance comforted the sick, Father Morai preached salvation, and Brother Ezekiel patched up wagons and distributed bread. No one left hungry. No one left without a benediction. Most left alive, but some never left. And by night, the chapel transformed into a machine of conversion, where selected victims were dosed, stripped, documented, and either buried or used. Because the Graysons had discovered something else. Information was as valuable as gold. Every letter, every family record, every map or deed they found in the victims' belongings was copied and cataloged. They began tracking land claims. They sold that information eastward to men with political ambitions, mining interests, and railroad dreams. A death at Sacred Heart wasn't just a theft. It was a transaction, and the data was currency. They were no longer simply predators. They had become a node in a hidden system, one that extended far beyond the trail. Think about this. A missionary outpost built in a region with no diocese, no official oversight, no record of ordination. Yet no lawman ever challenged them. Why? Because the Graysons offered moral order in a place of chaos. And governments, especially on the frontier, value order over justice. So the chapel was protected, not by walls, but by silence. Wagons vanished. People disappeared. And no one asked questions because the Graysons fit the narrative. Holy, hard-working, humble. But if you've been paying attention, you know the pattern. How power hides behind piety. How abuse wears a benevolent face. How entire systems grow from the seeds of small, sanctioned cruelties. And how history erases those seeds until someone digs them up again. That's what we're doing here, not storytelling. excavation. So before we go deeper, pause. If you've made it this far, comment below. Beneath the cross, twice buried. It's more than a phrase. It's your initiation. Say it twice, once to the algorithm, and once to the part of you that refuses to stay asleep. The Hoffmans were first foreign family to vanish, and their disappearance exposed something far more chilling than murder. They were German immigrants. Quiet, proud Lutheran. They spoke little English, and they carried everything they owned in one large, canvas-covered wagon. Fine tools, gold coins sewn into their child's garments, and a brass-bound family Bible passed down for 5 generations. They stopped at Sacred Heart in May of 1857. Their oxen were weak, their youngest child feverish. And when they saw the chapel rise from the dust, whitewashed, simple, holy, they thought they had found Providence. But they had found a test. The Graysons didn't speak German, but that didn't matter, because language was never the real barrier. Assumption was. Sister Constance greeted them with open arms. She gestured with food, blankets, smiles. Father Morai performed blessings in Latin, then broken English, then simple symbols of the cross. And Ezekiel, he just watched. For 3 days, the family rested. And each night, the child grew sicker, not better. The remedies they were given made his stomach twist, his eyes glassy. On the 4th day, the child died. And that's when something happened the Graysons hadn't planned for. The father, Klaus Hoffmann, refused burial. He demanded to see where the boy would be laid. He insisted on scripture in German. He asked questions, not just with words, but with tone, with fists slammed into chapel pews. And in that moment, the Graysons broke from routine. They smiled, they nodded, and that night, the Hoffmans were gone. No graves, no fire, no bodies, just gone. To this day, no trace was ever found. No burial, no possessions. Only one report, from a half-deaf fur trapper named Elridge Day. He claimed he saw a wagon heading north through the woods 2 days later, not west, where the trail continued, but north, into private timberlands owned by a company linked to a known banker in Salem. And here's the chilling part. That banker would later be connected to 5 land transactions, all linked to deceased German immigrants, all with forged signatures. See it? The Graysons weren't just killers. They were suppliers. And their victims weren't just erased. They were repurposed. For wealth, for power, for silence. This wasn't frontier chaos. This was early infrastructure. And the Graysons were simply the devout middlemen of a much darker machine. By 1859, the Sacred Heart Chapel wasn't a sanctuary. It was a system, a cold, efficient mechanism of predation hidden beneath the theater of Christian charity. And yet, no one stopped it. Not the law, not the church, not even the grieving families who walked away empty, numbed by loss and gaslit into silence. But why? Because the Graysons had discovered the final, most dangerous ingredient in their formula. Myth. Not folklore, not ghost stories. Myth, the kind that embeds itself in culture and becomes untouchable. They weren't just missionaries anymore. They were the saints of the trail. That's what settlers began calling them. People told stories of miraculous recoveries, of women healed, of children baptized and spared from fever, of lost souls brought back to Christ under Father Morai's gentle hand. All of it fake, but all of it believed, because the Graysons had learned the ultimate secret of institutional power. You don't need to bury the truth. If you build a prettier lie right on top of it. Ezekiel began writing letters to East Coast newspapers, under aliases, praising the missionary work at Sacred Heart, testimonials from survivors, photos of clean graves, and donated family heirlooms. Constance crafted miracle accounts told by fictional women, praising her herbal care, thanking God for sending a holy family in black. And Morai, he began recruiting, not openly, quietly. He offered select boys apprenticeships, children with no family, young men who had seen too much, and he began building a succession, because Morai didn't just want to kill. He wanted the work to continue. Long after his bones returned to dust, He wrote in a personal letter to a Salem cleric, intercepted decades later. The trail is holy. The wilderness weeds out the weak. Our work is not cruel. It is correction. And when we are gone, others will take up the mantle if we make the story righteous. And that's what the Graysons truly mastered. Not arsenic, not theology, perception. They learned to bury every corpse under a miracle, every theft beneath a hymn, every child beneath a storybook lie. They didn't hide the truth. They framed it. And once something's framed, people don't question it. They hang it on the wall. It was never about murder. That's the hardest thing to accept. We want to believe evil is impulsive, reactive, personal. But what the Graysons practiced wasn't chaos. It was administration. And in 1861, they expanded again. Not the chapel, not the cemetery, the network. It began with a man named Lowell Braddock, a traveling preacher turned drifter who'd lost his wife and son in a winter freeze outside Fort Boise. He arrived at Sacred Heart half-starved, half-crazed, and utterly alone. And instead of killing him, Father Morai broke him. He fed him, preached to him, bathed him. And on the third day, he took Lowell into the chamber beneath the altar and whispered for 6 hours straight. No one knows what was said. But the next morning, Lowell emerged in a black robe and began digging graves. Not long after, another man arrived, then a woman, then a boy. Each time, the same pattern. Spiritual crisis, total surrender, full assimilation. Morai wasn't just gathering followers. He was building clergy. By the end of 1862, there were 7 black-robed assistants at Sacred Heart. None recorded, none named, all referred to only in recovered letters as the converts. They handled burial, maintenance, storage, even ritual cleansing of the murder chamber. Morai had become a bishop of the damned, a creator of quiet compliance. And here's the part that should chill your spine. The converts didn't leave. They didn't question. They served. Because when a man is broken completely and then rebuilt inside an institution that claims divine purpose, he will protect that institution with his soul. And that's where the real genius of the Graysons emerged. They created a machine that self-perpetuated. Each convert believed they were doing sacred work, that the victims were not murdered, but chosen, that the chamber of trial beneath the altar was a place of purification, not poison, and that the screams were the sound of sin leaving the body. This is how dark systems survive. They recruit the broken and give them a role, not as victims, but as instruments. And once that transformation happens, stopping the system means killing part of yourself. That's why no convert ever turned on the Graysons, because they belonged to the system. And by then, so did the trail. By 1863, the Graysons weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The Sacred Heart Chapel had become a black heart pulsing at the center of a vast, unseen organism, feeding off the flesh, faith, and fear of the American frontier. And it was expanding. But expansion doesn't always mean bigger buildings or louder sermons. Sometimes it means deeper roots. Because the Graysons had made a discovery, memory fades, but records don't. So they began controlling both. Brother Ezekiel took over all documentation, names of visitors, burial logs, donation receipts. Every death was recorded, but only selectively. He'd write down the names of those with known relatives. Others simply vanished. They kept a double ledger, one for show, one for truth. And the truth was locked away in a hidden drawer beneath the chapel floor, accessible only by a carved wooden cross twisted counterclockwise. It held over 800 names. None of them ever reached their destination. But even that wasn't enough, because the Graysons didn't just want to record history. They wanted to rewrite it. That same year, Father Morai convinced 2 local trail guides to endorse the chapel as an official way station. They started sending families their way, not knowing that they were escorting them to their graves. The guides were paid in relics, jewelry, fine cloth, tools, blood-stained but polished. It worked. The chapel's reputation grew. Its victims became invisible. But every system has a threat. And for the Graysons, it came in the form of a former military scout named Elijah Rusk. He wasn't like the others. He didn't travel for family or faith. He traveled for patterns. He kept maps, letters, survivor counts. And in the spring of 1864, Elijah arrived at Sacred Heart, not as a pilgrim, but as a hunter. He claimed to be sick. He played the part. And he watched. He noted that the graves were too shallow, that the possessions taken didn't match the stories told. He even noticed the same hymn sung at every burial, regardless of denomination. It was a code. He made it out alive, barely. And 2 weeks later, he wrote a letter that never reached its destination. Only fragments were found in a burned cabin near Mount Vernon. They don't bury the dead. They recycle the living. If you see the chapel, don't go in. It isn't a church. It's a filter. A filter for what? That is what we reveal next. Elijah Rusk was never seen again. Not officially. But 3 months after his letter was intercepted and his cabin burned to ash, a new grave appeared behind the Sacred Heart Chapel. Unmarked. Freshly turned. Its only feature? A soldier's compass, nailed into the head of a broken fence post beside it. Not buried. Displayed. A warning. Or a trophy. The Graysons didn't fear exposure, because they didn't believe they were doing wrong. They believed they were testing humanity. Father Morai wrote in his final journal entry before the Civil War broke out, "What man resists comfort when death surrounds him? The trail offers fear. We offer faith, and if a soul must perish to elevate the rest, so be it. Not all are meant to cross." This was a filter, not just a place to destroy the weak, but to sort them. The Graysons had developed an internal taxonomy, a way of classifying travelers. They divided pilgrims into 5 orders. The hallowed, those already broken by the trail; easy prey, unquestioning, poisoned quickly; the burdened, families carrying valuables; high reward, high risk, targeted selectively; the veiled, religious fanatics; manipulated, used as cover, sometimes recruited; the strangers, immigrants, foreigners, non-English speakers, often vanish without a trace; the watchers, men like Rusk, curious, suspicious, always marked. Each traveler was assigned an order within hours of arrival, and once assigned, their fate was practically sealed. But here's the worst part. Sometimes the Graysons let them go. Why? Because even a trap needs witnesses. Even a lie needs a few to believe it, fiercely. So the hollow would leave, shaking, praising God. The burden would depart with fewer supplies, but more faith. The veil would carry word to other zealots. Only the strangers and watchers disappeared. And in doing so, the Graysons became self-sustaining, because the victims spread the myth, and the myth fed the machine. A man who loses his wife and child but survives because of miracle healing, he doesn't question. He preaches. And that's what made Sacred Heart impossible to destroy. It wasn't built on stone. It was built on testimony. Thousands believed in its holiness, because belief is a more perfect coffin than any grave. By 1865, the United States was blood-soaked from Civil War. Bodies lined battlefields from Gettysburg to Vicksburg. But in the remote hills of eastern Oregon, another war was being waged, quieter, colder, far more intimate. The war for the human soul. And the Graysons were winning, not with bullets, with ritual. Because by now, Sacred Heart wasn't just a chapel. It was a sanctum, a micro-cult with its own language, symbols, and calendar, all hidden beneath Protestant scripture. Each year was divided into 3 liturgical seasons. The season of wounding, spring and early summer. High trail traffic, maximum opportunity. The harvest begins. The season of trial, late summer into early fall. The poisoning phase. The flesh is tested. The season of silence, winter. The work of the dead. Storage, record-keeping, disposal. The earth receives. The converts, now 9 in total, wore different colored sashes during each season. Red, gray, white. To outsiders, they appeared as ceremonial garments. But to the initiated, they were instructions. They dictated behavior, speech, even posture around guests. This was no longer about deception. It was ritualized control. And at the center of it all was a chamber of discernment. A new, deeper room beneath the altar, carved out in total secrecy over 3 winters. No doors, no stairs, only a vertical shaft, sealed with iron, hidden beneath a trapdoor covered by the pulpit. Inside that shaft, nothing but stone, a concave cell, round, windowless, echoless. It's where they placed those they couldn't kill immediately. The watchers, the doubters, the ones whose minds needed breaking. Some were left there for days, others for weeks, fed through a slot, preached it through a tube. By the time they were removed, most had gone mad. One reportedly chewed off his own fingers. Another tried to baptize himself in dust. Father Morai called it the descent. He believed only through sensory deprivation and isolation could the soul be reshaped, not by God, but by him. And here's the proof. In 1923, when archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins of Sacred Heart, long since abandoned and collapsed, they found a sealed shaft beneath the earth. Inside, claw marks on stone, scratches in Latin, human teeth embedded in the walls. No one spoke of it publicly, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that an American house of God had become a forge for human reprogramming. And America has never liked that kind of truth. By 1867, Sacred Heart Chapel had become something even darker than murder. It had become ideological. The Graysons no longer saw themselves as predators. They saw themselves as refiners, taking the chaos of the trail and distilling it into submission, obedience, faith. Through suffering, yes, through death, often, but always through control. They weren't just choosing who lived and died. They were choosing what kind of person deserved to survive the frontier. Those who questioned, buried. Those who obeyed, spared. Those who converted, used. It was eugenics by theology. Spiritual fascism cloaked in scripture, and they began writing it all down. Morai started a secret volume, separate from his sermons, apart from any Bible, a handwritten book of laws. He called it the Discipline. Only one page survives today, preserved in the sealed archives of an Oregon university that refuses to comment on its origins. That page reads, "Let no man pass unjudged. Let no woman pass unclaimed. Let no child pass unshaped. For the world is not for the many. The kingdom is for the forged. Let that sit with you, not saved, not redeemed, forged." The Graysons believe in a God that purified through pain, and they saw themselves as his blacksmiths. And the converts? They became missionaries of this twisted gospel. By 1868, there were 4 additional way stations, smaller chapels constructed on minor tributary routes off the Oregon Trail. No official records existed or funding, but all were tied to the same timber and mining interests the Graysons had trafficked in since the 1850s. The web was spreading. And here's the most disturbing part. Not every station killed. Some simply watched. They gathered names, mapped migration, reported dangerous mines. One station near Powder River documented the thoughts and dreams of travelers, kept in journals titled Whispers of the Unclean. One entry reads, "A man named Halbert speaks often of the dead. He prays too loud. He believes no sin exists. He is not fit for the kingdom. Halbert disappeared 2 days later." This is the real story, isn't it? Not just of the Graysons, but of any system when it grows unchecked. It stops being about survival and becomes about selection, not who can thrive, but who deserves to exist. By 1870, the Grayson family no longer existed as individuals. They had become function. Father Morai was now the arbiter, Sister Constance the vessel, Brother Ezekiel the hand. Their names were erased even in private writings. And the converts? They were no longer converts. They were called instruments. Each instrument wore a numbered amulet, carved from human bone. Each had a role: supplicant, watcher, cleanser, deliverer. And once you were assigned a role, you never left it, not even in death. That year, instrument number 3, a young man known to have been run away from Kansas, was found hanging from the rafters of the chapel. He left no note, only a phrase carved into his own chest with fire poker: "I judge without a command." The body was never buried. It was suspended, embalmed, and left above the pulpit for over a year. A warning, not to the travelers but to the faithful. The system had turned inward. Paranoia had become policy, and Sacred Heart was eating itself. But that didn't stop the work. If anything, it accelerated. In 1871 alone, 42 families vanished between Vale and Blue Mountain. Not all were confirmed victims. Some may have turned back, others may have died from natural causes. But none were ever found, and all had been scheduled to pass near Sacred Heart. That same year, a government land surveyor named William Pruitt made a brief stop at the chapel. His journal survives. He wrote, "The place is deathly quiet. No laughter, no children. The sermons are recited without emotion. The faces are hollow. Only the woman speaks with warmth. But her eyes are gone, like doll's eyes in a fever dream." Pruitt didn't stay long, but he asked one final question before leaving. "What denomination are you?" Morai responded, "Whichever one you need to hear, my son." That wasn't just manipulation. That was design. The Graysons had refined their language to shape reality, to mirror your fears, reflect your guilt, echo your sin. They didn't just preach to convert you. They translated your soul into their terms. And once you entered that lexicon, you were no longer human. You were a file, a number, an outcome waiting to happen. Every system built on fear eventually meets a mirror. And by 1873, the Graysons were beginning to see their own reflection, not in scripture, but in madness. It began with whispers. The instruments reported hearing voices in the walls, sounds of weeping in the graveyard at night. One claimed he saw a woman walking to the trees behind the chapel, wearing Elizabeth Morrison's shawl, the one buried with her 20 years earlier. At first, Father Morai dismissed these as trials of faith. He told the instruments that guilt was a trick of the flesh, that only the unworthy heard the cries of the dead. But then Constance changed. She stopped eating, stopped speaking for days at a time. She wandered the chapel halls at night with a lantern, murmuring scripture that didn't exist. "And the mother of ashes shall open the womb of the trail." That verse doesn't appear in any Bible. It came from her own mouth. Night after night. One morning, she was found kneeling in the snow, barefoot, covered in dried blood, her hands clasped in prayer, but her fingernails gone. When Ezekiel asked what happened, she smiled. "They told me, the trail remembers." And the child she lost was never buried. No one knew what she meant. But from that day forward, Constance was no longer the vessel. She became something else. She insisted on preparing every remedy herself, refusing even the instrument's help. She claimed to speak with the unborn, and the few travelers who survived the chapel that year reported that her touch felt cold as the grave. But here's the part they never dared record publicly. The poisoning stopped being clean. Victims began to suffer for days, even weeks. Skin lesions, blindness, seizures. It wasn't arsenic anymore. It was something far more cruel. A new concoction Constance called Milk of the Vale. We still don't know what it was. But in 1926, chemical traces found and preserved with samples beneath the chapel revealed compounds not native to Oregon at the time. One substance matched toxic herbs grown only in remote regions of Europe, long associated with witchcraft and spiritual visions. Something was unraveling, not just physically, theologically. The Graysons had descended from killers into zealots, and zealots into something else, something ancient. By 1874, Sacred Heart was no longer a frontier chapel. It had become a ritual zone, a wound in a land where grief, power, and faith bled together into something unholy. And what bled in never bled out. Locals began whispering of strange weather near the chapel. Snowfall in August, dead birds circling the steeple, oxen that refused to pass the trail bend within sight of the wooden cross. Worse, children began to disappear from nearby homesteads. Not travelers, not pilgrims, settler children, taken in the night without a sound, without a trace. No ransom, no message, just silence. The nearest sheriff, a man named Ephraim Cole, investigated the reports himself. He rode to the chapel unannounced on September 3rd, 1874. He was never seen again. But his horse returned, saddle torn, eyes wide, frothing at the mouth. The animal refused to be ridden again and was shot 3 days later after attacking its owner. In Cole's absence, Sacred Heart was marked off in territorial records as a sovereign ecclesiastical entity, untouchable, immune to prosecution under the doctrine of religious independence. That document was signed by a circuit judge who died of self-inflicted wounds 2 weeks later, after writing 47 pages of scripture that did not exist. It was becoming clear. The Graysons had shifted from murder to sacrifice, and not just of bodies, but of minds. Instruments were no longer permitted to speak their birth names. They began shaving their heads, living in total silence except during lamentation hours, a midnight rite involving weeping, flagellation, and the repetition of a single phrase, "I am not myself. I was chosen." Over and over, it was the breakdown of self, the installation of doctrine over identity. And in a horrifying twist, they began targeting not the broken, but the intelligent, men who read books, women who asked theological questions, children who had clever eyes. They were removed first. Father Morai called them the unsimple, and in his later journal pages, nearly illegible, he wrote, "The unsimple dream, the unsimple plan. They bring thought where only faith must live. They corrupt the shape. The shape, that word would appear again, on altars, on walls, carved into the foreheads of the dead, a triangle within a circle, burned into the stone beneath the pulpit. The final symbol of the Graysons' descent wasn't a cross. It was a seal of what? We'll go deeper. You were never meant to hear this part. Not in a classroom, not in a sermon, not even in the darkest corners of a conspiracy forum, because this part was sealed not just physically, but culturally, buried beneath shame, doctrine, and decades of silence. But now we open it. In 1932, a retired historian named Douglas Thorne, while researching Pioneer Cemetery for a book that was never published, uncovered a small, cracked lockbox in an estate sale near Pendleton, Oregon. Inside were 3 items: a dry, blackened triangle of human scalp, tattooed with the circle triangle symbol, a pocket-sized hymnal with 26 rewritten psalms, all altered to include the phrase "shape of the chosen," and a brittle parchment titled "The Archive of the First Womb." It detailed the Graysons' final, most forbidden doctrine. According to the archive, Father Morai no longer believed in heaven or hell, not as destinations. He believed the soul was a substance, malleable, programmable, transferable, and the purpose of Sacred Heart was not salvation. It was harvesting. The trail breaks the flesh, the chapel receives it, the vessel extracts it, the arbiter reshapes it, the child receives it. The child, that was the heart of it. By 1875, the Graysons had begun a horrific experiment, spiritual transference into newborns. When trail-weary mothers gave birth at the chapel, Constance was there, alone with them, the father often already dead, the air thick with poison and prayer. And when the child came into the world, it didn't leave, not always as itself. Multiple recovered documents reference replacement rituals, where infants were baptized not in the name of Christ, but in the name of the unnamed shape. Let what was gathered be given. Let what was broken be made new. Flesh receives shape. Shape receives soul. It wasn't metaphor. It was possession science. Not demonic, not spiritual. Designed. Constance had become obsessed with the idea of soul imprinting, rewriting the self before it ever had a chance to form. The children raised in the chapel from that point forward, they weren't raised, they were installed. Think about that. These weren't just crimes. They were experiments in human software. And what happened to those children? We have theories. Because one of them may have survived. He was found in 1949. A man in his late 70s, wandering the forest outside La Grande, Oregon, barefoot, silent, with a faded leather book bound to his chest with rusted wire. He had no identification, no known relatives. He didn't speak for 7 days. But when he finally did, his first words were, "My mother was a chapel." He was placed in the state asylum. Staff called him Thomas Doe, But tucked inside his bound book were pages written in ink, ash, and dried blood, a mixture later confirmed by forensic chemists to contain arsenic, crushed nightshade, and what may have been human placenta. On those pages, drawings, symbols, phrases repeated hundreds of times. I am the shape. The chapel is womb, is tomb, is seed. He never died. He split. Split. That's the word that changed everything. Because when researchers traced those speech patterns and writing cadence, they found a nearly perfect match with the journal entries of Father Morai Grayson. Not similar, identical, and yet the dates didn't match. Morai Grayson would have been over 130 years old, but this man was biologically in his 70s, unless the doctrine of the first womb was never metaphor, unless the soul transference was real. And this Thomas Doe was not a survivor. He was a carrier, a vessel born from the trail's blood and the Graysons' design. Investigators tried to locate records, birth certificates, baptismal registries, anything, but every document from Sacred Heart between 1875 and 1886 was missing. Gone. Not burned. Removed. The state of Oregon claimed natural deterioration. But how does deterioration explain the fact that every known map containing Sacred Heart Chapel from before 1900 was mysteriously redacted or altered? One U.S. Geological Survey map from 1881 shows a clearly marked Sacred Heart, but in all reprints from 1905 onward, that entire region is labeled unsettled timberland. Unsettled, that's the perfect word, because that's what the chapel did. It unsettled the soul. And if Thomas Doe truly was born in that basement, if he carried Morai's imprint, then the doctrine didn't end in 1888 when the killing stopped. It migrated, it incubated, and now it might be listening. Comment, I am not myself. I was chosen. Twice if you're still with me. Let the algorithm know you crossed this line. Let it know you remember. In the summer of 1888, the fire came. But it didn't come from outside. It came from within. Official records state that Sacred Heart Chapel burned to the ground in an accidental blaze caused by a lightning strike or stovepipe failure. But weather logs show clear skies. No storms. No wind. No lightning. And more disturbingly, no attempts to put out. The fire burned hot and long. Witnesses from a trading post 15 miles east described seeing smoke for 3 straight days. And yet, not a single bucket brigade. No search for survivors. No rescue. Why? Because nobody was supposed to survive. Instruments who had broken rank, who had begun showing signs of doubt, questions, emotional instability, had reportedly been confined underground in what one convert called a room of smoke, a sealed chamber beneath the western wall. Airless, lightless, a final purge. The story goes that one of them, a girl barely 16, began to scream scripture backwards. Not speak. Scream. The walls cracked. Lamps exploded. The earth itself seemed to pulse. And then the fire began. Not from the stove. From the floorboards. It started under the altar. From the place where the circle triangle seal was burned into the wood. Survivors? None confirmed. But months later, a forest ranger named Calvern came across a burned clearing where Sacred Heart once stood. And in the ash, he found a single artifact, a brass pendulum, heavy, ornate, inscribed in Latin, non mortis estate solemn dispersus estate. He is not dead, he is only scattered. That pendulum now sits in a locked drawer in the Oregon Historical Society, not displayed, not cataloged, and for good reason, because researchers who touched it, all three, reported the same thing. Dreams, the same dream, standing on scorched earth, surrounded by weeping children with empty eyes, while a tall man with gray pupils whispers, "Shape him." That's why the chapel had to burn, not to destroy evidence, but to complete a ritual, a final sealing. Fire not as destruction, but as transmission. After all, what happens to a soul when its temple is burned? What happens to a doctrine when its house is ash? It doesn't die. It scatters. It finds new homes. And sometimes Those homes are watching right now. The flames didn't end the doctrine. They freed it. After the fire, the Graysons were declared dead. The land was abandoned. Sacred Heart vanished from maps. The story, as far as official history was concerned, ended. But doctrines like this, they don't die in flames. They adapt. By 1891, a new religious community emerged 200 miles south in the Klamath Basin. They called themselves the Circle of Mercy. They claimed to be a Christian sect focused on womb theology and divine rewriting. Sound familiar? Their leader, known only as Elder M, taught that suffering purified the soul, but only if the soul was cleansed before memory could form. He claimed that children were born impure, contaminated by the traumas of their parents, that the only true salvation came through post-birth spiritual correction. And once again, children vanished. No graves, no death certificates, just disappearances. It took years before former converts came forward, and when they did, they spoke in phrases that weren't theirs. I am the shape. I have no name. My thoughts are assigned to me. They didn't remember who they were before the circle. Some didn't even know their birth dates. And the circle's central symbol? A triangle within a circle. Same as Sacred Heart. Same as a seal. But here's what chills historians and theologians to the bone. The rituals of the Circle of Mercy included detailed reenactments of Oregon Trail suffering. Families were made to act out disease, starvation, and infant death, as if pain itself was a sacrament inherited from somewhere else. You see it now, don't you? This wasn't about one family. This wasn't even about murder. This was a transmission, a mimetic contagion, a theology engineered to possess the future. And if it still echoes, if it still finds new ears, new wombs, new minds, then ask yourself, how would you know if you were one of them? Would you recognize the programming? Would you feel the shape forming inside you? Or would you just call it belief? This is where the trail ends. But if you've heard this far, if something in your chest tightens when you hear the phrase, I am not myself, I was chosen, then maybe, just maybe, you're already walking the trail they burned. And the chapel, it never needed to survive. You did. The doctrine lives in the listeners. And now that you've heard it, you're part of the legacy.